You're too dumb to run this business. That's what my brother sneered, dismissing me like I was nothing, like I would always be in his shadow. So I made a move he never saw coming. I sold the family business for $10 million. Now, while I thrive, he's drowning, watching the empire he thought he owned vanish overnight. He built his world on arrogance. I tore it down with one signature. I still remember the exact moment my brother told me I was too dumb to run the family business. His words, sharp and cutting, echoed in my ears, reverberating through the hollow corridors of my mind, long after he'd said them. It was a late evening in our office, a time when everything felt still and quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. We were sitting across from each other, the table between us heavy with unsaid words. I had spent years working in the family business, every day grinding through the motions, trying to make something of myself under the watchful eyes of our parents, who seemed to always favor him. Jake, my older brother, the golden child, the one who always got the attention, the praise, and the opportunities. And there I was, struggling to prove my worth, my intelligence, my potential, always coming second, never enough. "Listen, Sarah," he began, running his hands through his hair in that way he always did when he was frustrated. "You're just not cut out for this. We've tried, but I've got to be real with you. You're too dumb to run this business. Maybe it's time you accepted that." The words hit me like a punch in the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I had always felt overshadowed by him, but I never thought he would just outright dismiss me like this. He wasn't wrong that we had disagreed on how to run things in the past. I'd always pushed for change, wanted to innovate, to expand, to do things differently. But I never imagined that my ideas, my vision, would be met with such ridicule. I sat there, trying to hold back the tears, clutching the edge of my chair as if it were the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I knew I wasn't dumb, but the way he said it made me question everything. Had I been wasting my time? Was I not capable of being the person I'd always dreamed of becoming? "I don't know why you insist on making everything harder than it needs to be," Jake continued, his voice softening but still dripping with condescension. "Just let me handle it. You go back to your office, stay out of the way, and let me do what needs to be done." The anger that had been bubbling inside me for years finally started to rise. It burned in my chest, fierce and unrelenting. He didn't know me. He didn't understand how hard I'd worked, how much I had sacrificed for this business, how much I wanted it to succeed. How could he, with his smug arrogance, dismiss everything I'd done, everything I was? "I'm not dumb, Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "I've been working harder than you ever realized, and if you don't respect that, then maybe it's time for me to show you just how wrong you are." The days that followed were a blur of quiet resentment and forced smiles. Jake acted like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just reduced me to a mere shadow in our shared family legacy. I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They haunted me. Too dumb to run the business. They played over and over in my mind, like a broken record, each repetition carving deeper into my confidence. It wasn't just his dismissal that hurt, though. It was the realization that I had been living in his shadow for too long. I had let him take the reins, let him dictate the direction of the business, even though I knew I had ideas that could transform everything. The next few weeks were the hardest. I watched Jake call all the shots while I sat quietly, waiting for an opportunity to prove myself. I stayed late in the office, poring over reports, analyzing market trends, thinking of ways we could grow, but every time I suggested a change, he shot me down. "We don't need your ideas," he would say. "Things are fine the way they are." But they weren't fine. We were stagnating. I knew it, and deep down, Jake knew it too. but his pride wouldn't let him admit that. He didn't want to admit that I might be right. One evening, I was sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the numbers in front of me when it hit me. The thought came uninvited, but it was clear as day. I could sell the business. I could take all of the work I'd put in, all the ideas I had, and walk away with enough money to start something new, something of my own. The idea of selling the business felt like a breath of fresh air after suffocating in Jake's shadow for years. It was the one way I could prove to him and to myself that I was capable, that I didn't need to stay and fight for his approval. I could build my own path. That night I stayed up late, making calls, reaching out to potential buyers. I knew it was a huge decision, one that would change everything, but I was tired of being underestimated, tired of feeling like the dumb one. I had spent my whole life trying to prove my worth to my family, especially Jake. But this time, I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for me. The following morning, when I told Jake about my plan, I could barely hold back the smirk that threatened to break out. His face twisted with disbelief, then quickly shifted to anger. "You're really going to sell it?" He spat, his voice rising. "You think you can just walk away like that? Do you have any idea what you're doing? You'll ruin everything." The words hit harder than I expected, but this time they didn't faze me. I wasn't asking for permission. I was done waiting for Jake to see me. This was my decision now. "I'm doing what's best for me," I said, my voice unwavering, "and I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me otherwise." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of negotiations, contracts, and sleepless nights. I'd been preparing for this moment for a long time, but nothing could have truly prepared me for how everything would unfold. I knew selling the family business was a risk, one that came with no guarantees, but the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. This was the only way I could reclaim control of my life, the only way I could stop feeling like I was constantly playing second fiddle to Jake's dominance. I worked tirelessly with potential buyers, reviewing offers, and weighing the pros and cons of each. Some were more promising than others, but none of them felt right until I found the right fit. A buyer who saw the value in what we had built and was willing to take it to the next level. I didn't just want to sell the business to anyone. I wanted to make sure it would continue thriving, even without me. One evening, after what felt like endless rounds of back and forth, I finally received the offer I'd been hoping for. The buyer's proposal was everything I had hoped for: fair, lucrative, and with the potential to expand. When I signed the paperwork, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was done. The business was sold for a staggering $10 million, an amount that, even a few months ago, would have seemed like an impossible dream. But here I was, staring at the contract, knowing I had made the right choice. I didn't tell Jake immediately. I wanted to see his reaction for myself, to watch the shock settle into his face when he realized the magnitude of what I had just done. I knew he wouldn't believe it at first. He had always been so certain that I couldn't handle the responsibility, that I didn't have what it took to make bold decisions. The next day, I called him into the office. I could already see the frustration in his eyes. He'd been hoping I'd back down, that I'd second-guess myself and come crawling back. Instead, I handed him the signed papers. His eyes flicked over the document, disbelief spreading across his face as he read the terms. "You sold it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did," I replied, my heart racing, "and for $10 million. He dropped the papers onto the desk, as if the weight of them was too much for him to handle. His face was a mixture of anger, regret, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, but I could feel it in the air. It was the sting of humiliation. The look on his face confirmed everything I had been thinking. He had never believed in me, never thought I could succeed without his guidance. And now, here I was, holding the future in my hands, while he was left to grapple with the reality that he was wrong. You, you sold it for how much? Jake stammered, his voice thick with disbelief. That's, that's absurd. You don't know what you've just done. You've ruined everything. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was our business. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. He had never understood. He had always thought he was the one in control, the one with all the answers. But it was clear now I was the one who had been right all along. I had built this business up from the ground, and I was the one who knew what it needed to survive and thrive. You never saw me, Jake, I said, my voice calm but firm. You never saw my worth, but I knew what I was doing all along. I did see it. The following weeks were a blend of triumph and disbelief. While I was navigating the flood of emotions that came with the sale of the business, Jake was struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. He couldn't grasp it. For days, he barely spoke to me, his anger simmering just below the surface. Every time he saw me, it was as though he was looking at a stranger, someone who had defied him, who had defied everything he thought he knew about running the business. I expected the resentment, but what I didn't expect was how deeply his regret would sink in. He began calling, texting, and showing up unannounced at my office. The phone would ring, and I knew it was him before I even looked at the screen. I still can't believe you did it, he'd say, his voice strained, like he was grasping for some sense of control. You've ruined everything, Sarah. You had a future here. We could have built this together. Each time I listened quietly, letting his words wash over me without letting them penetrate. He had never believed in me, never truly seen what I was capable of. And now that I had proven him wrong, all he could do was try to convince me that I'd made a mistake. The problem was, I knew better now. I knew that I had made the right choice, and nothing he said could change that. Then came the phone call that shook me. It was a Friday afternoon when Jake left me a voicemail, one that seemed desperate, almost pleading. Sarah, he said, his voice rough, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to go on without you. We've been doing this for years, and I can't figure it out on my own. I need you. Please, don't leave me like this. I listened to the message more than once, each time feeling the familiar pang of guilt twist inside me. There was a part of me, just a small part, that wanted to help, to ease his pain, to show him that I wasn't trying to destroy everything, but I wasn't his savior. I had tried to show him, tried to make him see my worth all these years, and he hadn't listened. Now it was my turn to stand firm, to remind myself that I was no longer that person who sought validation or approval. I didn't return his call. Over the next few days, Jake's regret began to show itself in new ways. I started noticing the small cracks in his facade, the nervous glance when we ran into each other at family gatherings, the way he would hesitate when talking about the business as though he was unsure of what he was doing without me. He had always been the one who dominated conversations, the one who made all the decisions. But now I saw something else, something far less certain, far more fragile. One afternoon, I ran into him at a cafe. He was sitting alone, his usual confident posture gone, replaced by a weariness that I hadn't seen before. He looked up when I walked in, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. Sarah, we need to talk, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I sat down across from him, but I didn't speak. I had nothing left to say. He had made his choice all those years ago, and I had made mine. We both knew that. I never thought you'd go this far, he admitted, staring down at the table. I was wrong about you. I thought you'd always be, well, the backup plan. I thought I was the one who knew everything, but I see now I was wrong. You were right. You always were. I could feel the weight of his words settling in, but I wasn't moved. I wasn't angry anymore, just numb, watching him finally admit the truth that had been so painfully obvious to me all along. "You never saw me as an equal," I said, my voice steady, even though I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. "You never believed in me, and that's something I can't undo. But I've moved on now. I'm not going back." His shoulders slumped as though the last of his pride had left him, leaving nothing but regret in its wake. I could see the change in him, but it wasn't enough. He had underestimated me, and now he had to live with that. As the weeks passed, Jake's desperation became more apparent. Every time we spoke, he seemed to be grasping at straws, trying to find some way to fix things, but there was no fixing what had been broken. I had done the unthinkable, sold the business for $10 million, a sum that made it impossible for him to ignore the success I had achieved. It wasn't just the money that stung him, though. It was the realization that I had outgrown him. For years, I had been the one in the background, the one left to clean up the messes he made. But now, I was the one in the driver's seat. I had made my own destiny. Jake had always prided himself on being the alpha in our family, the one everyone looked to for answers. But now he was scrambling to maintain his position, all while watching me build something new. It wasn't just the family business that was slipping away from him. It was his sense of control, his position in the family hierarchy. I could see it in his eyes when we had brief conversations. The uncertainty was there, hidden behind the facade of bravado. His words, once full of arrogance, were now tinged with a quiet admission of defeat. I had never expected Jake to apologize or even acknowledge my success. I knew him too well for that. But seeing him struggle with the very thing he had once taken for granted, his place at the top, was a kind of sweet justice. It was as if the universe had turned the tables, and for the first time, I wasn't the one left with my tail between my legs. I had built my future on my own terms, and I wasn't about to let him or anyone else take that away from me. But even as Jake stumbled, the family dynamic was changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents, who had always sided with Jake, were beginning to question their blind loyalty to him. They started calling me more frequently, asking about my next steps, how I was planning to manage the newfound wealth, and what my plans for the future looked like. It was strange at first. After years of being overlooked, I found myself suddenly the focus of their attention. It was both uncomfortable and exhilarating, like stepping into a new role I had never fully imagined for myself. Despite everything, I tried to remain cautious. I wasn't about to let their newfound interest sway me. The years of feeling invisible, of being dismissed in favor of Jake's charisma, had taught me one valuable lesson. I was capable of standing on my own. The path I had chosen was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my parents, cloud my vision now. As the months went on, my life began to shift in ways I had never imagined. The business was gone, but the freedom it had given me, both financially and emotionally, was more than enough to make up for it. I took the money from the sale and invested it in new ventures, most notably in a tech startup I had been dreaming about for years. I wanted something that challenged me, something that allowed me to use my creativity and vision in a completely different way. I was no longer the passive participant in my own life. I was the one making decisions, calling the shots. I poured my heart into the startup, assembling a team of talented individuals who shared my passion for innovation. The business world had been a game to Jake, but to me it was a calling, a way to truly build something that would last. I was no longer the person who needed to prove herself to others. I had already done that by selling the family business and securing my future. Now I was building a legacy of my own. Jake, on the other hand, had no such direction. The business he once ruled was no longer in his hands, and he struggled to find his footing. I watched as he tried to rebuild his reputation, reaching out to old contacts and trying to resurrect a semblance of the success we had once shared. But nothing came easy for him anymore. The confidence he had once exuded was replaced with uncertainty, and the more he tried to force things to work, the more the cracks in his armor became visible. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction in watching him struggle. I had spent so many years living under his shadow, constantly doubting my own abilities because of his harsh criticism. But now I could see that his success had always been a result of family connections and privilege, not because he was some infallible genius. Still, I didn't let myself become consumed by his failure. It wasn't about revenge for me. It was about personal growth. I was living the life I had always dreamed of, free from the constraints of familial expectations. And as I sat in the boardroom of my new startup watching the team brainstorm ideas for our next big project, I knew that everything I had been through had been worth it. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. Jake's struggles became more public as time went on. It wasn't just the business that he was losing control of. It was everything he had built his life around. Without the family business, his sense of identity seemed to unravel. I watched him try to salvage what he could, throwing himself into a series of failed ventures, each one more desperate than the last. Every time I ran into him, he had a new idea, a new project that was going to turn everything around, but nothing ever seemed to work. It was a painful thing to watch, to see someone who had once been so certain of their success reduced to grasping at straws. For the first time in his life, Jake was forced to face the reality that the world didn't owe him anything. No one cared about his legacy. No one cared about his last name. All that mattered was what he could do now, on his own, without the safety net of the family business to fall back on. At family gatherings, the tension was palpable. Our parents, who had once been staunchly on Jake's side, now seemed uncertain. They started to ask me about my new venture, my startup, and they listened when I spoke about the progress I was making. It was a strange feeling, having them seek my approval for the first time in years, but I didn't let it go to my head. I had been through too much to fall into the trap of pleasing them just for the sake of it. Jake, on the other hand, had started to make subtle attempts to win them back. He would call our mother to talk about the good old days when the business was thriving, trying to stir up nostalgia for a time that was gone. But I could see the cracks in his facade. The calls were less frequent, and he seemed to be running out of excuses as to why things hadn't worked out. He came to me one evening, his shoulders slumped, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. He looked like a man who had been stripped of everything he had taken for granted. "I know I messed up, Sarah," he said quietly. "I know I didn't give you the respect you deserved. I thought I could fix everything, but I was wrong. You were right all along. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." The apology, if you could even call it that, wasn't for me. It was for his own peace of mind. He needed me to forgive him so he could absolve himself of the guilt. And yet, despite his words, I felt nothing but emptiness. The years of emotional neglect, the constant undermining, had created a chasm between us that couldn't be bridged with a few half-hearted words. The business was gone, and so was the person I had been in his eyes. He had lost not just the business, but his place in my life. The transition from the family business to my own ventures wasn't easy, but it was the most fulfilling decision I'd ever made. I threw myself into my new startup, every day pouring my energy into something that felt real, something that was mine. The initial challenges were numerous: raising funds, building a team, navigating the competitive landscape. But I didn't let any of it deter me. Every setback became an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become even more determined. With the $10 million from the sale of the business, I was able to hire the best minds, invest in technology that would help scale my vision, and build a company culture based on innovation and inclusion. I surrounded myself with people who believed in me, who saw the potential in the ideas I had nurtured for so long. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would leave a lasting impact. As I built my company, I began to realize just how much I had underestimated myself. I had spent so many years believing that I needed my family's approval, that I needed to live up to their expectations. But in creating something from scratch, I discovered a new sense of freedom. I wasn't just doing it for myself. I was doing it for the people who trusted me, for the team that believed in the vision I had put forth. But there was another realization that came with success. I wasn't interested in tearing Jake down anymore. I had spent so much time thinking about how to get back at him, how to prove him wrong. But in the end, the best revenge wasn't about his failure. It was about my success. I was no longer that person who needed to fight for validation. I had already achieved what I set out to do. I still saw Jake occasionally, but our interactions were brief and distant. I could tell he was still struggling, still trying to rebuild his life in a way that made sense to him. The truth was, he was trying to find himself in the ruins of the family business, while I had already moved on. I had learned to build something new, to take risks, and create something that reflected my own values and dreams. And for the first time in my life, I felt at peace. My legacy wasn't tied to the family business or to Jake's opinion of me. It was something I had created on my own, and nothing, not even my brother's regret, could take that away. Time continued to pass, and life moved forward, but there was always a lingering question in the back of my mind. Had Jake really learned anything from all of this? Had he changed, or was he simply biding his time, waiting for a chance to prove that he could rise from the ashes? I didn't have the answers. What I did know, however, was that I had stopped needing those answers. I had stopped needing anyone's approval. As my business continued to grow, my confidence grew with it. I had surrounded myself with a team that respected me for who I was, not for the last name I carried. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The support from friends, mentors, and employees who believed in me fueled my drive every day. I was no longer a secondary character in my own story. I was the protagonist. Jake, on the other hand, was still trying to put the pieces together. His ventures remained unsuccessful, and the weight of everything he had lost, his position in the family, his control over the business, his sense of identity, was slowly suffocating him. It wasn't that I felt satisfaction in his failure, but I realized I had built a life on my own terms, without relying on anyone else's approval. I could never return to the person I had been in his shadow, and he could never go back to the life he once led. We were both in the midst of building new identities, and somehow I felt pity for him. He had no idea how to rebuild the life he had lost. I had already found a new path. One evening, after a long day at work, I received a text from him, simple, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" I sat there, staring at my phone, weighing the decision. Was I ready to engage with him again? Was there even a point? I had already made peace with everything, but was this conversation just another chapter in the cycle of our fractured relationship? I replied, but only with the words I felt were necessary. "I'm not the person you once knew. I've moved on, Jake. I've built something real, something that matters, and you can't change that by just apologizing now. I'm sorry, but I'm not the one you need to fix things with." There was a long silence before he responded with a single word. "Understood." It was over, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to look back. It's strange how much we shape ourselves based on the expectations of others, only to realize later in life that we've been living someone else's version of our story. For so many years, I had lived in the shadow of my brother, trying to gain his approval, trying to prove myself worthy of my family's love. But in the end, the only approval that mattered was my own. Selling the family business for $10 million was just the beginning. It wasn't about the money, though that certainly helped secure my future. It was about the freedom to build a life that reflected who I truly was, not who I was expected to be. I learned that success isn't defined by others' standards, and it's not about competing with those around you. It's about defining your own path and having the courage to walk it, even when no one else believes in you. In the end, Jake's regret was his own to carry. The family business was gone, and while I moved on to create a legacy of my own, he was left behind, still trying to reclaim something that had already slipped through his fingers. I could feel no bitterness toward him anymore, only a quiet sense of closure. I had finally found peace, not in the approval of others, but in the work I was doing, the relationships I was building, and the family I had started to forge on my own. My children, my team, my friends, they were my real legacy. They were the ones who saw me for who I truly was. I wasn't a daughter trying to prove herself. I wasn't a sister fighting for attention. I was simply Sarah, strong, independent, and finally free to create the life I had always dreamed of.